Asian markets opened with cautious optimism today as global investors hold their breath for what could be the most consequential week for interest rates in months. The U.S. Federal Reserve is virtually certain to cut rates for the first time since December, while the Bank of Canada is also expected to join the easing party with their own quarter-point reduction. But there's one man who's absolutely furious about how this is all playing out, and his name is Donald Trump. For months now, Trump has been launching increasingly desperate attacks on Fed Chair Jerome Powell, calling him incompetent and demanding massive rate cuts. Just this past Sunday, Trump declared that Powell was hurting the housing market and couldn't help with cutting rates. The president has even threatened to fire Powell, saying his termination cannot come fast enough. But here's the thing, Trump's relentless pressure campaign appears to be backfiring spectacularly. Markets are now 100% certain the Fed will cut rates by 25 basis points this week, bringing the federal funds rate down to 4.0425%. But futures show only a 4% chance of the larger 50 basis point cut that Trump has been demanding. Powell has made it crystal clear that the Fed's decisions are based solely on economic data, not political pressure. As he put it recently, we're never going to be influenced by any political pressure. The irony is delicious. Trump's tariff policies, the very policies he's so proud of, are actually the reason the Fed has been hesitant to cut rates more aggressively. Powell recently admitted that the Fed would have cut rates by now if Trump's tariffs weren't so substantial. Those tariffs are starting to push up inflation, creating exactly the opposite effect Trump wanted. It's a masterclass in unintended consequences. The president's sweeping trade war has created uncertainty that's keeping the Fed cautious about cutting rates. Businesses can't plan ahead when trade policies change based on the president's social media posts. This uncertainty is exactly what Fed officials cite when explaining their measured approach. What makes this even more complicated is how Trump's tariffs are affecting our allies. Canada finds itself in an impossible position, already engaged in trade disputes with both the United States and China. As one former Canadian ambassador recently noted, Canada has already taken action on Chinese EVs but received no recognition from Washington. The message from Ottawa is clear. If you want our help, treat us as an ally rather than as an enemy. This diplomatic tension only adds to the economic uncertainty that's working against his own stated goals of economic growth.
We have already stand to help the U.S. achieve its objectives, and in fact, Prime Minister Carney could repeat that, Canada was one of the first nations to impose heavy tariffs on Chinese electric vehicles, but we have not, we didn't get any brownie points in Washington for that, and therefore we would say, look. Yes, we want to work together, but let's sit down, come up with a good plan. And this means also that you have to treat us as an ally rather than as an enemy. And I think that, if Trump were to, because he is, if we don't follow suit, what could he do if he imposed more tariffs on Western allies? That will have more repercussions on the American economy, and that will penalize him, and he won't be able to achieve his economic goals. So, again, I think what is interesting is
Trump's attacks on Powell have become increasingly unhinged. He's called the Fed chair a fool, a stubborn mule, and a stupid person. He's even tried to fire Fed board member Lisa Cook over what he claims are mortgage fraud allegations. But these desperate moves only highlight how little control Trump actually has over the independent Federal Reserve. The president's frustration is understandable from a political perspective. High interest rates are indeed hurting the housing market, with 30-year mortgage rates still hovering around 6.6%. Americans are struggling to afford homes, and Trump knows this could hurt him politically. But his public tantrums and threats are achieving the opposite of what he wants. Powell has actually strengthened his position by standing up to Trump's pressure. During a recent awkward encounter at the Fed building, Powell publicly pushed back on Trump's claims about construction cost overruns, asserting the Fed's independence right in front of the cameras. It was a moment that crystallized the power dynamic. Powell calm and professional, Trump clearly frustrated and out of his depth. The situation gets even more embarrassing for Trump when you look at what's happening globally. The Bank of Canada is expected to cut rates by a quarter point this week, but for very different reasons than Trump's demands. Canada's economy is actually showing signs of weakness, with GDP likely declining 1.5% in the second quarter due to trade disruptions, many of them caused by Trump's own tariff policies. What's particularly striking is how Canada's economic challenges reveal the broader impact of Trump's trade wars. With unemployment rising to 7.1% and employment insurance coverage at its lowest since 1941, Canada faces what some economists describe as an unprecedented situation. The old rules of economic integration between the US and Canada no longer apply. As one economist recently warned, falling productivity isn't just a cyclical issue, it's businesses holding on to workers while deciding whether to shutter or relocate entirely. This isn't a normal business cycle. Traditional economic thinking simply doesn't apply anymore.
I think this would all be fine if we weren't dealing with Trump, because no renegotiation of CUSMA or anything else, I mean, we're not going to save the trade deal. We've gone through the looking glass. We are not integrated with the United States anymore to the extent that we have had to jack up our defense spending. So if you think spending's out of control, but you don't want more spending on defense, you got a problem, because that's the world we're now in. We're in a world where maybe Russia is going to trigger a third world war. We're in a world where we're trying to recreate our alliances to protect our own sovereignty. We are not even talking about business investment anymore. We're talking about our ability to protect ourselves from the north, from the south, from wherever, because we have been in the crosshairs of the president's desire to take us over in many different ways, and it's total pandemonium south of the border. We are not in a regular business cycle. Falling productivity is happening because people are hanging on to their workers so that they don't have to lay them off as they wait to see, are they going to shutter entirely? Are they going to relocate entirely? We are not in a normal business cycle. To Goldie's point, if the interest rates come down,
China's central bank might also trim rates amid their sluggish economy, while the European Central Bank has been more measured in its approach. The difference is that these central banks are responding to actual economic conditions, not political pressure from their leaders. Trump's criticism also reveals a fundamental misunderstanding of how monetary policy works. The Fed controls short-term rates, but longer-term rates that determine mortgages and business borrowing are influenced by market expectations and the Fed's credibility. By constantly attacking Powell, Trump is actually making it harder for long-term rates to come down. The president's attacks on the Fed are also historically unprecedented. Past presidents have generally respected the central bank's independence, understanding that political interference can lead to inflation and economic instability. Countries where politicians control monetary policy tend to have much worse economic outcomes. Even some of Trump's own allies are getting nervous about his Fed attacks. His top economic advisor recently said there won't be any political coercion over the Fed, but Trump's own statements contradict this. It's creating confusion and mixed signals that make effective economic policy harder to implement. The timing of Trump's latest attacks is particularly poor. With inflation showing signs of picking up again and the labor market potentially softening, the Fed needs to carefully balance competing risks. Trump's public pressure makes this delicate balancing act much more difficult. Meanwhile, Trump's broader economic strategy is falling apart on multiple fronts. His recent calls for European NATO allies to stop importing Russian oil have been dismissed by defense experts as very weak and illusory. Countries like Hungary, Slovakia, and Turkey are economically dependent on cheap Russian oil and are unlikely to comply with Trump's demands. Despite G7 economic pressures and frozen Russian assets being used to fund Ukraine, Russia continues to have full support from China and India, with multiple workarounds in place, making Western economic pressure increasingly ineffective.
Of G7 finance ministers, what kind of economic pressures could the G7 put on Russia to ramp up the pressure?
Again, not much. They're talking about various assets being, Russian frozen assets being, the money's taken from that, used to finance the Ukrainian war effort. Fine, you can do that. Ukraine will get more money. great, they can buy more weapons. But what's the bottom line to all this? The Russians are winning the war on the ground and in the air. And the only way that the Europeans, the Ukrainians, Canadians, Americans are trying to pressure the Russians to stop, never mind lose, stop, is economics. And on that one, that's a tough road for them to actually succeed in pushing the Russians to where they want them to be. The Russians have the full support of China, India as well. They have multiple workarounds in place. So I think this is a bit, if I might say, a desperate attempt by the West to pressure the Russians to come to a ceasefire and stop on the road to defeating Ukraine.
Powell's term as Fed chair ends in May 2026, and Trump will get to nominate his replacement. But the damage from these public attacks may already be done. By politicizing the Fed, Trump has made it harder for any future Fed chair to maintain the credibility needed for effective monetary policy. The international implications are also significant. Other central bankers are watching how the U.S. handles Fed independence. If Trump succeeds in politicizing the Fed, it could undermine confidence in the dollar and U.S. financial markets globally. What's most striking about this whole situation is how Trump's own policies created the problem he's now complaining about. His tariffs are pushing up prices, making the Fed more cautious about cutting rates. His constant trade threats create uncertainty that businesses hate. And his attacks on Fed independence undermine the very institution he needs to help his economy. As markets prepare for this week's Fed decision, the contrast couldn't be clearer. Powell and his colleagues will make their decision based on economic data and their dual mandate of price stability and full employment. Trump will continue his Twitter tantrums and threats, achieving nothing but further undermining his own economic agenda. The Bank of Canada's expected rate cut this week will provide an interesting contrast. Governor Tiff Macklem has managed to maintain his central bank's independence while dealing with similar economic pressures. The difference is that Canadian politicians generally respect their central bank's autonomy. Trump's Fed attacks are also creating problems for Republican lawmakers, many of whom privately support Fed independence but feel pressure to back their president publicly. This puts them in an awkward position of either contradicting Trump or undermining an institution that's crucial for economic stability. The housing market that Trump claims to be defending is actually being hurt by the uncertainty his attacks create. Mortgage lenders need predictable policy frameworks to price their products effectively. Trump's constant threats and policy changes make this much harder. Looking ahead, this week's Fed meeting will be closely watched for any signs that political pressure is influencing decisions. But Powell has shown remarkable resilience in the face of Trump's attacks. His press conference after the rate decision will be particularly important for signaling the Fed's continued independence. The broader lesson here is about the importance of institutional independence in a democracy. The Federal Reserve was designed to be insulated from political pressure precisely because monetary policy works better when it's based on economics, not politics. Trump's attacks threaten this fundamental principle. As Asian markets digest all these developments, the contrast between Trump's chaotic approach and the measured responses of other central banks becomes even more stark. While Trump rages on social media, serious policymakers are quietly doing their jobs based on data and analysis. The ultimate irony is that Trump's attacks on Powell may actually be helping the Fed chair. By standing up to political pressure, Powell has enhanced his credibility with markets and other central bankers. This makes his policy decisions more effective, not less. This week will be a crucial test of American institutional strength. Will the Fed maintain its independence in the face of unprecedented political pressure? All signs point to yes, which means Trump's campaign of intimidation has not only failed, but actually backfired. The Fed will cut rates when economic conditions warrant it, not when the president demands it. And that's exactly how it should be in a functioning democracy.